Well, tēnā koutou katoa. No America ho no te tematanga, no otatahi toku kainga inai nei, e roia toku tanga mahi o Perryfield Lawyers, ko Steven Moe toku ingoa, no reira ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. Hey, it's a real privilege to welcome you all to this session that we're going to be talking about charities and tax. And we are really looking forward to this. Jenny, Craig, and I caught up before this, and we're excited. You know, it's good to be able to share information and have discussions about topics that matter. So thank you for joining us. I'm just going to start with a karakia before I hand over to Jenny, who's going to be facilitating our session today. Whakataka te hao ki te uru. Whakataka te hao ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta. Kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura. He tio, he huka, he hauhu. Ti he Maori ora. And that is the English translation. Get ready for the westerly. Be prepared for the southerly. It will be icy cold inland and icy cold on the shore. May the dawn rise red-tipped on ice, on snow, on frost, a glorious day. So, Jenny, I'll pass it over to you, and thank you.
Kia ora, and thank you very much. Thank you for that karakia, and thank you for putting this webinar together. It's wonderful to be here. I'll just quickly introduce myself. I see the names of many old friends and colleagues here, but my name is Jenny Gill. I'm currently living in Auckland. I have a long career in philanthropy and also in the not-for-profit sector. Sir Roy Mackenzie and I set up Philanthropy New Zealand back in the 80s when I was working for him. And I retired about 5 years ago from being Chief Executive at Foundation North. And I'm now on the board of a number of grant-making philanthropic trusts, but retain a really big interest in the sector. And obviously this issue is one that has come up from time to time. I mean, I have had a number of meetings over the years with ministers of finance about this issue. So it does feel like the whole issue of the definition and the taxation of charities comes round about every decade. And we've hit it again. So thank you all very much for attending. Please make sure you're on mute. And as Stephen said, please note that the meeting is being recorded. Before I ask Stephen and Craig to introduce themselves, I just want to thank them for taking leadership on this issue. I think it's a really, really important issue for the sector, and the paper and the kind of commentary that's evolved out of it, I think will be very helpful for a number of us. We do have the opportunity to put messages in the chat, questions in the chat, and I will be trying to collate those as we go along. But we've also agreed that after the meeting, we will go back, and if there are questions that we've been unable to answer in this session, we'll try and get a response to you after the meeting. I think it's important to say before I hand over to Craig and Stephen that we're not lobbying for specific changes in the charity sector, but what we are seeking is clarification and to throw some of the issues and inaccuracies that we have seen in the media recently, and they were repeated again on Friday night on national radio. So this is an issue where I think there's a lot of public misunderstanding, there's a lot of public concern, and a lot of public misunderstanding. So I think I'll hand over to you to introduce yourselves. Stephen, could you introduce yourself to the group, and then we'll segue straight to Craig. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Jenny, for being willing to do this, to facilitate us. I think I'm really looking forward to this session. So really brief introduction. I've met many of you on the call already, but for those who don't know me, I always feel like I need to explain my accent just to start, in that I'm from America originally, but moved here when I was 7 years old. So I actually grew up here down in the South Island in Otatahi, Christchurch. And I've worked in large international law firms in London, Tokyo, and Sydney. But when I came back from the overseas travel 9 years ago, I kind of reinvented my career to be focused on impact and purpose. So that's the umbrella under which I act. So I work at a law firm called Perryfield Lawyers, and we have an impact team, and we're basically working with people who have more than profit at the heart of what they're trying to do. So that is often charities, but also we help lots of for-profit companies that are just doing things a little bit differently. So yeah, that's the brief introduction. And in the chat, I'll put things as we're talking. Like that karakia, I do a podcast called Seeds, so I put a link to someone explaining that. So yeah, involved in a few different things, but I'll pass it over to Craig.
Kia ora tātou e te whānau. Thank you, Stephen. Craig Fisher, for those that haven't met me, I am a chartered accountant, but I will stress I'm not a tax guy. I have spent most of my professional career as a financial auditor across commercial organisations, government organisations, and particularly charity and other for-purpose organisations. I'm a former standard setter around auditing and professional standards for accountants, and been heavily involved in service performance reporting, and I guess tried to be a very strong advocate in that space, both in New Zealand and internationally, for the for-purpose and charitable sector and what they need to report differently rather than just treating them as commercial entities, which sadly they were done in the past. I have a long involvement with charitable organisations, being a trustee and chair of various. And these days, a lot of my time is taken up as a consultant and an advisor to various charities, a few philanthropic bodies, and also to commercial organisations around governance. But very passionate about this issue. We need a strong, healthy, sustainable charity sector in New Zealand. It's an important part of the fabric of our society. And that's a big reason that has driven Stephen and I to put this paper together to try and break some myths, get some better information out there for people to fight back with some of the misguided assumptions that seem to be thrown around glibly in the media. So, Jenny, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, you've kind of segued into my first question, but I'll throw it to Stephen anyway. Stephen, what compelled well, the two of you really, to co-author this paper at this time?
Yeah, thank you. So Craig and I have worked together on other papers in the past. We did one called The 7 Hard Questions That Charities Should Be Asking, which was during COVID, because as you will remember, there was a lot of panic about what does this mean. So that's a link in this paper as well at the end of the introduction. So we'd worked together, I think, quite well because Craig's able to bring that accounting background and auditing background, and I'm able to bring the legal background. And the two of us were kind of despairing, I'll be honest, because the media statements that were coming out about proposed changes to taxation of charities, and they were such broad brush statements that were in the media, like charities have 2 billion of untaxed profits, which actually, if you break it down, that's not actually accurate. And we feel like this sector is one that does such amazing work that people are busy doing the mahi and doing the work, and so aren't able to lift up their voices and actually kind of call people back to first principles about, well, what is important. So it was a combination of seeing different media reports and also talking with people who we respect and have know a lot, but they just didn't seem to have thought through some of the almost philosophical reasons when it comes to charities and their tax position. So we just wanted to have an objective look at it and actually lay it out in one hopefully easy, simple to read place where people could actually then take it as a positive narrative. And if somebody says something about a negative instance of one charity doing something wrong, they can
Aria,
use it to say,
I just
actually,
want you to
there's
go onto
other
the
ways
onto
of doing
TV.
things.
Well, what do you?
Sorry, can you mute yourself, please?
Your battery check up there.
Alexis?
Let me get it.
Alexis?
You're on mute.
Can you mute yourself, please?
There
Sorry,
we go.
Stephen.
No, that's good. Yeah, so that was the point of it, was really to be able to have a hopefully positive framing around the role that charities play in society and be able to provide examples of stories, really, of things that can be said that counter against this negative narrative of somehow charities are taking advantage of the system or they really need to be taxed because that's not fair. So that was the intent behind it. Craig, do you want to add anything else on that one?
I think you've picked up a really good point, Stephen, in terms of the negative media landscape. And unfortunately, a lot of our media leads more and more with negative. You know, if it bleeds, it leads, is a media saying. Um, Also, our media has, I think, if you look at it over the last few years, got more and more sensational and down to sound bites on issues rather than actually deep discussions on issues. So we need to be very careful that those sound bites are actually accurate. And we've seen a few really inaccurate ones recently. Um, uh, there's also in this whole debate around charities a whole lot of confused issues and conflated issues is what we're seeing in the media. I also go back to a former auditor view. You know, as a financial auditor, when you're looking at any population of entities, there's always going to be 5% of bad actors, and 1 or 2% of those are probably outright rogues. But 95% of most populations are trying to do their best and doing a really good job. There's a real danger when you apply that generalization to the charitable sector, because what that sometimes means is 1 or 2 bad actors can influence the public view or perception of the 95 or 99% of organizations that are doing a fantastic job. And unfortunately, we find in this sector that people commonly throw a blanket over issues, treat all charities as the same, rather than actually look at the uniqueness and the huge diversity that's out there in terms of organizations, operating styles, all of those things. So it's really important that people do understand the issues and are able to actually come back with a positive narrative.
Thanks. Would you like to just expand a bit on what you described as confused and conflated issues, or possibly give us an example? Might be the easiest way into it.
I'll kick off on that one. So some of you may have seen in the last few days the odd article about Destiny Church, and some what, in my personal opinion, appears to be some reasonably abhorrent behaviour in terms of going shouting and threatening people. Um, the fact that a single organisation carries out its activities in a way that most of the population may find objectionable should not be conflated with all charities or all religious charities, as I think the conflation that I've seen, are doing bad. So that's to me is a fine example of something which is really sad, getting a whole lot of media interest and been conflated almost with a soundbite that there's something wrong with religious charities, when religious charities have always, in the main, formed a very important part of our social fabric in New Zealand.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you want to comment, Stephen?
Oh, just to add to it, I've actually seen a few articles, including in Stuff recently, basically saying there's this example of this particular church. All churches should have tax exemptions removed. So it's like this huge leap between there's one instance of one group of people, doing something that we probably don't agree with. I think all those on the call can probably agree with that part. But then to make that jump to all churches should not receive tax exemption. Like it's just a great example of the logic or the arguments, because what they're forgetting is that religious groups, and I'm not talking just about Christian religious groups, I'm talking Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, spiritual groups, the role that they play in society is very difficult to quantify in terms of money. But I guarantee you that if you went to local places, neighborhoods or towns or schools, those groups are out serving on the front line when it comes to youth, the elderly, the sick, the poor, in many, many different ways. So there is actually positive things that are being done. And that just sort of gets forgotten because this one example hits the media.
Thank you.
Can I add to that a little bit further, Jenny? I
Yeah.
think there's a distinction there between an entity's tax status as a charity and an entity's behavior as a charity. And I think that there's a concern there, or a mixture of issues around if we have a lot of regulation over charities in New Zealand. We have a lot of requirements for charities to be very transparent in how they're carrying out their charitable purpose. There's way more reporting for a charity than there is for your standard for-profit company. Um, but the tax status is somehow being confused with whether they're actually complying with the requirements or not. So two separate issues.
Do you want to expand on that a little bit more, please?
So a charity tax status comes from being admitted as a registered charity, and if I use that term. So if an entity wants to set up as a charity, they need to prove to the Registrar of Charities, which is DIA Charities Services, that they are established for charitable purposes, that they are carrying out their work without things like private pecuniary gain being possible. And it's quite a thorough and can be quite long process in order to become given the charitable status. Once you have charitable status, you're then required to ensure that you remain charitable. And there's various reporting and transparency requirements as part of that. The benefits of being charitable. One is public credibility from your charitable status, that people can rely upon you as being an organization which has jumped through these hoops to become charitable. And secondly, some tax exemptions, such as the ability to receive donations, the ability to not have to pay income tax should you have any business income.
And just to finish that thought from the legal perspective, it is onerous to become a registered charity. So sometimes clients will come and they'll want to do something, but it doesn't qualify to be a registered charity. So actually getting into that list, there's currently about 29,000 registered charities, but there's a lot more groups out there that are not registered charities. And for many of them, it's because they didn't meet the criteria. So just a reminder, there's 4 heads of charity, and this traces back to 1601. So these have been around for a long time. There's advancing education, advancing religion, reduction of poverty, and purposes beneficial to the community. So there's obviously a lot of subtlety once you get beyond the headline of each of those. But the point is that it is rigorous to become qualified to be a registered charity, and then to continue as a registered charity includes things like reporting requirements. So it's important not to forget that.
Thank you. Could we just talk a bit about business activities? Craig, I think that you raised it. Would you like to expand on that a bit? Because I think that is one of the more contentious issues that we've seen discussed in the media recently. I'd also
Thanks,
like
Jenny.
to, I just would like to encourage you, if you have questions, put them into the chat. None come through yet that I can see, but let's just look at, oh, here we go.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. And yeah, business income, you're right. Business income was the issue that kicked this off, which came, well, the thing that brought it to my attention was some announcements by a government minister late last year around charities having $2 billion in untaxed income, which we'll come back to that point because I don't actually think it was called actually profit, I think. And I think there's some clarifications around that which are really important. Business income for charities, if we look at how charities get their revenue or are able to obtain money to do whatever the charitable purposes they exist for, there's basically about 5 ways. Firstly, charities can be the recipients of generous individual donations of people. That's very common in New Zealand. New Zealand's a very generous country individually, which is fantastic. They can receive donations and grants from the likes of trusts and foundations and other philanthropic funders. Again, we're pretty generous in this country as regards the amount of funding that comes from those as a source, supporting charities to do their charitable mahi. Thirdly, charities can get contracts for services. We saw this in COVID. Some of the most effective deliverers of services to community were actually charities, iwi, church bodies, and the like. So carrying out contracts for service funded either by the government or in some cases by commercial organizations or other philanthropics. Interest income on passive savings is another way that charities can get income. That's assuming, of course, that they've actually got some savings. And a lot of charities would love to have some savings and to be able to earn income on that, but many don't. And then the last thing, which is where we get to business income, the last method, if you like, of charities to earn business income is out of an active business operation. So charities taking the risk, the business risk, and also funding the resources needed to actually set up and operate a business in order to earn income. Because charities have a restriction around private pecuniary gain, i.e. money can't go to an owner of that business or an individual. It could go to an owner if the owner was another charity. But basically money can't leave the charitable sphere, if you like. Then charities currently have a exemption from income tax on business income that they may operate. Businesses and charities, if you walk down any high street in New Zealand, you won't have to walk too far generally before you'll bump into a charity op shop. I dress mostly out of op shops. They're a fantastic recirculation of clothing and also helping lead a little bit more of a sustainable lifestyle. Most of those you will find actually are run for a charity's purpose. The charities that do that will often run using volunteers, which is very good. They'll make some income, which will help that charity do the rest of the things that charity actually does, the charitable purposes. So, business income can be a very important, very pragmatic way of earning income. And I guess the last point I'd make just before I pass to Stephen on this is, if I look at those 5 different forms of income revenue raising that charities can have, it's only the last one that charities actually have much control over. All of the others are essentially relying on a paternalistic style of charity where someone else has to support you, rather than you being able to be supported by your own efforts, and you're taking your own risk and using your own resources in order to generate a sustainable income. So that's why I'm very concerned about this move or the suggestion that the business income of charities may be taxed. Stephen, over to you.
Yeah, no, that just feeding in probably 2 points to add to that. The first one being that, well, I like the way you talk. I think we spoke, Craig, about sort of the Oliver Twist mentality, please, sir, can I have some more? And that's really the paternalistic view that charities need to go out and ask for donations. Please give me something. And what I would like to see personally is that charities that they're encouraged to have more of a mindset of how can I get sustainable income from a variety of sources. And that might include owning part of a business, either wholly or partially, because it's encouraging them to be thinking in the long term. It's encouraging them to be thinking about where do we get our funding from. And the other thing is that very often these businesses can actually be advancing the purpose at the same time as achieving a business outcome. So think of if you're helping people who are coming out of prison, and it's hard to get that first job. So what if you set up a company that employs people who come out of prison? So there's a charity down here in Christchurch. That's what they do. So it's a great example of actually blending the business side with the purpose side. So I think that gets lost in some of the caricatures about charities running business. Many of these businesses are actually advancing the purpose. So that's important to be aware of. And then the second thing I would say is that I think when it comes to tax, oftentimes we're thinking of tax in relation to the person or the individual who's gaining something from the income. In other words, I made this amount last year from my job and I got taxed this percent. It's coming to me personally, privately as an individual. But for these entities which own businesses or which operate in creative alternative ways that are actually bringing in income. There isn't private gain. It's not like the money is coming back to the charity and then it's getting distributed to be shared among the trustees, or now the officers can get a bonus or something. It actually, because what we talked about before, charities are strictly limited by their purposes. They have to be advancing the purposes rather than coming back and then it goes for private gain. So it's like a different type of situation than a normal company scenario, because in a normal company scenario, there are shareholders and it, comes back to individuals. So it's just a different mindset, I guess, when it comes to this question, that I think that sort of subtlety gets lost when perhaps government is looking and saying we need to increase our revenue. Where can we look to do that?
Thank you. There's a few questions come through the chat, and there's one from Simon Bowden, which comments on the article by Ranjana Gupta, and that kind of links into the question a bit lower down, which my machine's not letting me look at, about how do you think we, the sector, can shine a light on some of the facts? How can the sector bring a balanced view? At present, it seems very one-sided, with articles being published from those outside the sector with a certain viewpoint. Often these articles have blatant errors. How do we highlight these errors or misstatements? So if we could answer that one, and then Peter's put a couple of questions in that I'd also like us to go back to. So who'd like to start on that one?
I'll start on that one because I got
Okay.
very annoyed with that article. There are a couple of blatant inaccuracies in it. There was a call for greater transparency, and as someone who's been a standard setter involved with standards in this country, especially around transparency for charities and not-for-profit entities. We have an excellent system in New Zealand to force charities to be very transparent. And the reason for that, sunlight is the best disinfectant. If you want to see what a charity is doing, any member of the public can go onto the charities register and search them and see their financial statements. If that charity is a large charity, they'll also be required to be audited to make sure that those financial statements are accurate. A recent innovation has been the addition of service performance requirements. So not just a charity stating what it's financially doing through the year, but also what its objectives were, what it set out to do, and what it's actually delivered. And the whole point of that is to allow the general public in New Zealand transparency, to allow the general public to make up their own minds as to whether they think this charity is actually doing worthwhile work and deserves their stakeholder support or not. So the calls for there needs to be greater transparency and they need to disclose their financial statements just did my head in. We have a really good system. To be honest, the Charities Register is one of the best publicly available databases in this country. And there are lots of other countries around the world which would love to have a database as good as ours. So, that's kind of annoying. There was also statements in there around business income of charities in Australia being taxed. No, that's incorrect. As I'm reliably informed by some of my Australian counterparts. So what can we do about that? The important thing is for enough people to actually know about these things and actually have a voice and provide a counter narrative, because unfortunately, unless a counter narrative is out there, things that are said can somehow become a fact. And, that's not a good thing. Stephen.
Yeah, well, just to add on to that, I mean, that was why Craig and I collaborated on this paper, which I think we started in December, and then we were both kind of writing bits of it over the Christmas break and coming back to. So we felt passionately about this to spend some of our summer time thinking, how can we articulate it? And honestly, I don't mean this to sound self-serving, but I hope that this paper is something that each of you would be willing to share with your boards. Would you be willing to tell another person about it? Like, that's how information gets out. It's one thing if Craig and I put something on LinkedIn, so maybe our networks can see it, but it's another thing if one of you sends it to your board or sends it to some other people. So to counter the misinformation, all I can say is let's get at least some correct information and hopefully a more balanced perspective that can get out. It literally takes 30 seconds to hit forward on an email. So let's try to spread information. And then I think if we see inaccuracies, I guess we can report them when we see them. I've written to that particular author and said, here's a copy of a paper, and it seems like you're maybe not fully correct on this, this, and this. So if enough of us do that, that has to help as well. But yeah, look for ways that we can get correct information out because right now it is a negative narrative that comes through. And I know that some of the people on this call are doing this as well. So I see Sue Barker's here. She's doing a great job of speaking up. Rahul from Philanthropy New Zealand, behind the scenes, they're looking at how they can have conversations. So there are people doing things, but each one of you knows people that we don't know. And that's how movements begin. That's how the counter narrative can happen. So please join us. That's all I'd say.
Stephen, can I jump in here with another related point on this? I commonly hear people complain in the sector when things change or when things happen that we need a sector support organization. We need a voice, which is kind of ironic in a way because a lot of charities actually exist to give voice to the voiceless. But it is a really common cry that you hear out there. And while I understand that, we have actually got quite a lot of subgroups within our sector, and that's really important. But I have to say, I think there's an element of giving our power away by saying we need someone to lobby for us or we need some voice out there. Actually, each of us can individually do things. And with respect, it's almost a cop-out sometimes to say someone else should be the voice for the sector. And I'm a great believer that 70% of something is way better than 100% of nothing. So, we can all get on and do something ourselves. And also, if I reflect on my experiences in the commercial world, especially around lobbying and organizations or sectors that lobby in the commercial world, they are all joined together and bound together in their lobbying activities by a real capitalistic dollars commercial imperative. That's the reason why lobby groups exist in the commercial world, is it's all about dollars. If it wasn't about the dollars for them directly, they wouldn't be involved in it. So I think we as a sector, which is very diverse, very widespread, actually needs to take a fair bit of responsibility for ourselves individually, and collectively, that's a very powerful voice. But my point is to just say that, oh, we need to have a lobby group for us. I don't think that's actually going to happen effectively, and therefore I don't think that will have cut through, and it can allow bad things to happen then if people don't call out behaviors which are unhelpful for the sector.
Yeah, and just one other point here. Each of you is probably involved in a charity or knows a charity that's doing good work. Why not tell that story? It won't take long, I promise. Take 1 minute, 2 minute, write a little statement. I ran into Jane the other day. They're doing amazing work over at fill in the name of charity. Did you know they've helped? Fill in number of people helped. Take a photo, post. Like the positive stories that we could each tell would help as well. And I'm sure Craig agrees with this. If you tag me or him in on LinkedIn, which is the primary social media platform I'm using, I'll like it, I'll comment. Like let's support each other as well, because that helps the algorithms to see it and then gets it out to a wider audience.
Jenny, can I just talk to the politics of this as well?
Yep.
Obviously, this whole issue has come from statements from ministers in the first place. A government exists because we vote them into power. And I often think of government as the collective us. It's not someone over there. It's actually a representation of all of us. So, we don't all have the same voices. But no matter what color the governments, in my experience, need what charities do. They want charities to be successful because charities do things often that governments can't do, or at least can't do as well, that governments won't do or don't do, quite simply. So, the importance of a strong, sustainable charitable sector is an important political message, no matter what government is in of the day. So, no questions about what color you may be looking at. And politics works, in my experience, on two levels. One, in terms of trying to create policy to get stuff done, and another one, trying to get re-elected. And the voice of people is really important in the trying to get elected one. So, we live in a democracy. Thankfully, we live in one of the best democracies around still. Our democracy rates really highly. Let's protect it by having our voice when that's needed.
Thank you. I mean, the other thing I was thinking, and it's a bit hard to see precisely who's on this call, but there are also, I think, some different issues possibly, depending on where you sit in the sector. So for philanthropic grant-making organisations, for example, most of them wouldn't have business activities until you start looking at investment as a kind of a passive, arguably it's a business activity, but a kind of a passive investment activity, as opposed to a charity which may actually have a business activity in order to generate a surplus, in order to either distribute it or to fund their activities. And so as this discussion goes on, I think it's going to be quite important to finesse what the impacts might be depending on where you sit in the sector. Do either of you have any comment on that?
I guess I'd just make the quick comment, Jenny, and you're quite right that it's one of those issues of people just throwing a blanket over the sector, because you're quite right. Issues for a philanthropic body, which is a charity because it makes sense for the philanthropic body to be structured in that way, will be quite different from a charity that is a frontline social services provider, say by providing lunches to schools or something like that. Throwing a blanket is dangerous. The result of throwing a blanket over something is unintended consequences. And those consequences are generally adverse, which we have a rich level of knowledge in this sector. And I think that's part of the reason, or part of the concern that I have about this issue is I think it's an issue that if there are proposed changes from any government, that they be appropriately consulted upon so that all of those voices and the richness of that knowledge and throwing up flags of avoiding unintended adverse consequences before they happen can actually happen. So it's really important that we do have genuine consultation and genuine discussion about things which may have very serious adverse consequences.
And that's what certainly the philanthropic sector has asked for, led by Philanthropy New Zealand. But it hasn't had, I have to say, an overwhelmingly positive response so far from various ministers' offices. I mean, one of the problems I think we have at the moment in the lead up to the budget, and you may wish to comment on this, is we don't really know what's being proposed yet. And there is some concern, budget day is not that far away, and there is some concern that there may be some quite tightly structured proposal within the budget package that the sector as a whole will not have been consulted on. Stephen, did you want to comment on that?
Well, just to say, we definitely think that's a risk. And that was another reason for writing the paper, is that we wanted to get more information out so that people, including ministers, could read information, because we weren't confident in what the consultation process would be. As Craig has said, we think that it needs to, that's fundamental. We put in the paper, I don't know how many on the call have actually skim read or had a look at it, but there's a great quote, to go fast, go alone, to go far, go together. And that concept of actually we need to think about this thoroughly, we need to talk together and then work out. I know these are bigger questions, but where are we headed as a society? And, what role does charity actually play within the framework? What I worry about is that there will be a knee-jerk reaction of we need to start taxing to get access to this revenue stream, but then it opens up a door. And I think Craig and I can probably admit that there might be situations where it is appropriate to tax in a certain context, but by opening the door for those little situations, the outliers, all of a sudden it's going to make it easier next year or the year after to say, well, actually, we're gonna look at this further now. And right now, I'm pretty sure everyone would say, surely the SPCA and the secondhand op shops, surely that's not covered because there's no real competition here at all. It's just they're taking secondhand goods and selling them and then using the money to advance charitable purposes. But once you open the door of saying, well, we're going to look at taxing business, all of a sudden it potentially could include that because it is a business and it's not directly related to the core business or of what the charity does. So what's to stop it happening in the future? And that's really our main concern, that next year, 5 years from now, that it starts to erode the position that charities play in our society.
Craig, do you wish to comment or?
I guess it's sort of slightly tangential, and that's business income or the competition aspect. So what I hear commonly as an accountant is it's really unfair of charities running businesses because they're unfairly competing with business. And I really question that unfair competition. I think we said in the paper that we've not seen dramatically cheap breakfast foods, for example, price cutting of a particular charity. Charities also operate with some special features. So many charities operate with an element of volunteer labor, in a lot of cases, complete volunteer labor. If a charity was doing a tax return as a tax-paying entity, I would expect them to be claiming all of the tax expenses that they could. And that's really interesting when you think about how many charities operate with an element of volunteer labor, that operate with peppercorn leases because people have charitably provided them premises, either at a below market rate. Charities not claiming all of the depreciation that a tax-paying entity would claim each year. So you may actually find that the level of income tax being lost, if I could sort of use that idea, would actually be very small anyway. I know we've had a couple of discussions with people saying, well, our charity made a surplus last year, but if we were a tax-paying entity and claimed all of these things, we would have made a loss. So it sort of strikes me as concerning that the government is looking at this sector for tax revenue, as would be indicated from announcements in the press, versus other opportunities for the government to raise revenue, especially when we have a government that's also professing wanting to support social investment, wanting to support innovative ways to deal with many of the hard, wicked problems in our country, such as housing, such as food poverty, that currently are being addressed generally by charities. So I'm just struggling with that mixed messaging that's coming out.
Craig, can we just go back to Peter's question in the chat earlier, which was, if business income of charities is taxed, will this lead to a number of charities deregistering? And I think there's a kind of a follow-on question from that, or will it lead to a number of charities restructuring their business activity?
Quite potentially, yeah. I think any organization will seek to maximize its position. Business organizations seek to do that using very expensive consultants and advice. Our sector often doesn't have that luxury, but there may well cause some charities to restructure what they're doing and how they're doing it. It would be very unfortunate because restructuring costs considerably. Accountants and lawyers get rich out of it, but that's money being taken out of the sector as well, and especially for organizations that are concerned about their charitable purpose.
Because I know there's an ongoing issue in philanthropy about imputation credits, for example, and philanthropic foundations and trusts' inability in many cases to reclaim the imputation credits that they pay on their investment income. So I guess it comes back to this unintended consequences issue a bit.
Well, that's where I feel, you're gonna cut your nose off to spite your face. You're gonna shoot yourself in the foot. Like it's all these metaphors, but it really is true. Like in the chat, somebody's saying, my entity relies on shop income. We couldn't provide our services for growing number of patients without it. Like there's there's going to be real world consequences if it does go the way that they seem to be hinting it's going to go, which comes back to why can't we have a clear and open discussion about this to work out what is appropriate? And I think we would probably favor that. I think as well, this is kind of just something that struck me yesterday because I went with my daughter who's 15 and she did the last time that she's able to do the Weet-Bix triathlon. So that's run by Sanitarium. And there was 2,300 young people between, I think, ages 7 and 15. But not just those 2,300 young people. There was the grandparents, the parents, the siblings. I'd estimate there was at least 6 or 7,000 people there celebrating health, exercise, well-being, looking after your body, trying, as in TRY. Like this is a positive thing. And we said in the paper, that's had more than 500,000 children do it. So I just get frustrated when that sanitarium's used as kind of a blanket, as Craig's saying, throwing a blanket over all charities because of this one. Actually, there is a lot of positive things which are done. So want to make sure people have a bit of ammunition to fight back against that narrative as well.
Ginny, I started off by saying I'm not a tax guy, but I do know a little bit about our tax system in New Zealand, and one of the beauties of it is actually compared to a lot of overseas jurisdictions, we have a gloriously simple tax system or tax structure. You only have to look at our GST versus Australia's GST and see that. Charities are given a very generic exemption at the moment from a tax point of view. So in terms of administering that, it's pretty easy. I worry about, okay, well then saying, right, we're now going to tax the business income of charities. So the question I think of is, well, okay, what's business income? Does that count if I'm carrying out my charitable purpose, but I'm actually earning some money out of that? Or does it need to be something completely separate from my charitable purpose? Business income, surely if I've got some investments in a KiwiSaver as a passive investment, that's business income, isn't it? Where do we draw the lines here? And as soon as you start making these little tweaks, you end up with all of these really hard questions of where is the line and what falls in and what falls out, which generally results in a lot of extra time and effort and cost, which just takes away from the sector as a whole and the amount of funds that it has to do good.
And it takes away from entities which are actually best placed to provide the services. So let's say you started taxing a charity, so then it doesn't have the money to do some of the good work that it does. But bear in mind that it probably has volunteers, it probably has lots of other people, it probably has vast decades of experience working with that local community. So you really are kind of, cutting your nose off because you're getting, sure, you might get a bit more tax income here, but if the charity has to fold and it isn't able to do what it's doing, is the government really then going to get enough back from the charity that doesn't exist anymore that it can then provide those services? I don't think so.
No. So we've got a huge number of questions come in and we're going to run out of time shortly. But one question here from Bethany says, for those of us who are able to meet with local MPs or ministers, what would you recommend as the key points to highlight beyond our own charitable impact? So can I ask Easter? I think it's, that could be very helpful. There've also been a couple of questions in here about data and the need for data and to start thinking about what the impact could be if income was to be taxed. But let's go back to that question in terms of if you can get to your local MP. One thing that I remember was when under the Key government, the Charities Commission was abolished. There was a huge outcry, but it was after the event. And apparently a lot of local MPs went to the then Prime Minister and said, you told us this wouldn't be of any interest to anybody. And so we supported the initiative to abolish it. So we don't want to be in this situation again, I think, where local MPs are unaware of the concern at an electoral level, at an electorate level, about what the impact of this could be. So can I chuck that question back to you too?
Well, I'll jump in. So from my perspective, it's all about the storytelling and it's all about explaining what the impacts would be. So the chat's actually really amazing. And if people agree, what we might do is circulate some of these comments afterwards, because I think we can just compile it. And then Craig, you and I, and Jenny as well, we might put some comments by the ones that we haven't been able to get to. But there's some great stories in here. The politicians need to hear these stories. Like we've got to tell these stories so that people understand the actual implications. So our paper hopefully is helpful as, an overview of the overall thing. But if we can get that with some stories, like here's how it would impact us on the ground with this subset of society, I think that would really help. And in the comments as well, I just noticed, I think Roger put a comment, is it the problem that we put charities as too blanket a term itself? And I think that is probably an issue as well. So highlighting how it's going to affect you in your part, that hopefully would help the unintended consequences to be addressed. Um, as a side note, Craig and I don't use the term not-for-profit anymore. We started a movement, and you're welcome to join. We talk about the for-purpose organizations or the for-purpose sector. So it's subtle, right? But it hopefully, because not is negative and it's in relation to profit, as if that's what we should be. So what we're trying to do is have more of a positive framing, because language is important. Craig, over to you.
Yeah, I just tautoko what you said there, Stephen. I think it's really important to just impress on any ministers the importance of the sector as a whole. And you having your individual stories is a great way to do that. And concern about the fact of possible tax changes, which I seriously, as an accountant, think would actually do very little in terms of actual revenue generation for the government. But I have no doubt that they would have a very chilling and negative effect in terms of dampening innovation, sustainability, all other things that the sector actually needs. Can I just jump in on a question, Jenny, that's there
Yep.
from Paul about charities services? Because we do have a regulator of charities in New Zealand. Now, I know there's a bit of debate about is that the right term for them, but they're the ones that administer the charities register and people getting charitable status. That ministry is now within the Department of Internal Affairs. It's gone through a number of restructurings. I really feel for some of those good people in that organisation. And if we have charities who are the 1%ers who may be ripping off the system with something cute, then that's where the regulator needs to come in and actually do their regulation job. I have a real concern about, does our regulator, or are they appropriately resourced? Some of the government cuts recently sort of remind me of that Monty Python sketch with the knight where, he's lost 2 legs and 1 arm, but, still going strong. So is our regulator appropriately resourced to actually chase the very small percentage of bad actors that may be out there giving everyone a bad name?
Thanks, Craig. I do think that's an important point, is that, well, from my perspective, if somebody is in blatant violation of the law, then the sector supports that person or that entity being dealt to. But my understanding from the work of Sue and others is that those tools are already there. They're just not always used. So that's quite important to make, I think, if you're in discussion with MPs, is that we do have the tools there. And sometimes there is concern in the sector that they're not adequately used. Stephen, do you want to add to that?
Oh, I think they are, Craig, we were forwarding to each other the Charities Services newsletter. So the two of us are on Charities Services Sector Group, which meets with them every few months, basically. And it looks like there is kind of, as part of all the public service changes, that there is some sort of restructuring which is going on even within that group. So I think, Craig, it was saying that it was coming under a different division, the regulatory division now. Is that your understanding?
That's correct, yeah. And just for clarification there, Stephen and I provide equal number of bricks as we do bouquets in that particular meeting. There's another comment here, Jenny, I wonder if I could quickly jump into, and that's who actually looks at the statements of service performance reports. The whole concept of service performance reporting was to help charities better tell their own story of their own positive impact and how they were going about that positive impact. So it's not something where you're being given a pass or fail by the regulator. It's actually our system in New Zealand trying to encourage better reporting on the right things rather than your reporting just be on financial matters in terms of did you make a profit or a loss, which, are terms that don't actually work very well in the charitable sector. So that's about you helping you communicate rather than being a test. However, it's fair to say that now that we have a whole lot of statements of service performance out there, anyone can get a much better idea about what a charity is, how big it is, what it does. And I know that a lot of philanthropic funders absolutely love them because it gives them 90% of the information they need about an organization as to whether they should fund it or not.
Thank you. And then that segues into Susan's question. Then I'll flick back to you, Stephen. Have you had any feedback conversations on this from funders? Really interested in how they view this potentially. I think funders are really concerned, those of us who've been meeting through Philanthropy New Zealand, and it's for two reasons. One is most philanthropic funders, the vast majority, if you put the imputation credits issue aside, are currently have tax-free status. So if your philanthropic funders get caught up in this, then obviously potentially that reduces the potential spend. And philanthropic funders at the moment are seeing a huge increase in both the number and amount of applications that they're getting as the not-for-profit sector comes under pressure for a vast number of reasons that we could spend a whole hour talking about. So I guess I just want to assure you that there is concern from the philanthropic funders, and we will be doing what we can as the sector to address that with the ministers that we have access to. Mm-hmm. But Stephen, over to you, and we have only got 2 minutes left.
Yeah, well, maybe we can have some wrap-up comments. I don't have anything on that particular point. I think you just explained that really, really well. I guess maybe if we're getting into the closing comments, and then maybe Craig, you can jump in, but my closing comment would be, we started the paper in an unusual way. You might have noticed if you've had a look, it says starting with thanks. And I think that we did that on purpose. We didn't want to get straight into the details of numbers and all that, because I think part of this narrative, part of this story is we've got to talk about the positive side of what charities do in our society. We have to start there because that's something that everybody can identify with, whoever they are, whatever political affiliation. I guarantee that at some point their lives have been touched by charity, whether it's a cancer charity, education charity, community group, sports group. So what we've got to do is break through the ideology or the rhetoric and get to the heart of what is the role of charity in society, and then try to correct this assumption that somehow charities are taking advantage of loopholes, when actually what they're doing is using their resources to be able to get sustainable income streams to the best of their ability to then advance their charitable purpose. And that it's constrained by being a registered charity, they must advance that purpose. And that's a safeguard. So that's what I'd be encouraging. And each of you are doing amazing mahi and work in the community. Talk about it. Tell people about it. Don't let the tall puppy syndrome come in and, oh, I'm not going to post, I'm not going to share. If not about what you do, why not talk about what that other person does? Let's get these positive stories out, and feel free to use this paper as a tool to be able to share and say, hey, have a look at this. That was why we wrote it. We hope that it will be another tool to get more messages out. Craig.
I'd love to see, well, I agree with all of that. Firstly, Stephen, thank you. I'd love to see clear problem definition here, because the messages that have been out really confuse me. I'd then like to see genuine consultation, because our sector has a huge amount of smart people and fantastic resources within it that can help any government, no matter which flavor of government we have. But that can only help if there is actually genuine consultation. I absolutely think charity services needs adequate resourcing. as a former auditor, if there are loopholes out there that are being abused by a very small percentage, they absolutely need to be chased and held to account by our existing and very good regulation and legislation in this area. However, that can only happen if the regulator is appropriately resourced. And to end, just a plea to everyone to communicate the value of the sector, the positivity of the sector, the challenges, yes, but the good mahi that's actually being done. That's my personal plea to everyone. The more the people that we have doing that, the more we can actually highlight the good rather than getting sucked into negative sound bites.
Look, thank you both so much. I'm sorry we've only had an hour, and I think it's really important that we make a commitment to those of you who've joined us, that we do pick up on the comments, because there's some really, really good material in there. Thank you both for being so positive. And thank you for taking the initiative and getting this paper out. Please do spread it widely, as Craig and Stephen have invited you to. And we will commit to keep in touch with you. And I think once we're clear of what the issue is that we may be approaching, then probably I think we will need to reconvene again and have another discussion. But thank you all, and please correct the misinformation wherever you can, whether it's around the dinner table with your parents at Sunday lunch, or whether it's at a barbecue with your mates, or around a board table. Because I think the amount of I've never seen so much misinformation about the charity sector in my, I've been working in the charity sector since I was in my 20s, and I've never seen so much negative coverage and misinformation as we're getting at the moment. So I think each of us needs to, pick up the banner and make sure that our fellow New Zealanders really understand the excellent work that's being done all over the sector at both a local and a national level. So thank you all. I think we'll end the call with that, and we will get back to you in due course. So ka kite anō. A lot of my old friends are here. Hello to those of you who haven't seen for a while, and hopefully we'll all see you again soon. Ka kite.